Mountain buries town under 150 feet of rock. Poggers.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over three more of the worst disasters in history. Frustratingly, as is too often the case, two of these
Do you fuck with the amazing adventures of Captain Underpants? Of course I do.
seem to have been entirely preventable, if not for a series of mistakes made by the people involved. Then, in contrast, the first story required a once-in-a-lifetime natural event to occur for what eventually transpired. But either way, in each of them, the effects were beyond devastating. As always, viewer discretion is advised.
Yeah. Hey. Yeah. Oh.
Not far north of the border between Montana and Alberta, Canada, sits the tiny, unassuming town of Frank. It's hard to imagine when looking at it
Imagine living in a town called Frank.
today that it was once a bustling mine town with a population of almost 1,200 people about 120 years ago. Only about 150 people remain there today, and to understand why that is, we first have to start more than 300 million years ago. It all began when Frank and much of what is now North America sat beneath the ocean, which was home to a variety of sea creatures with shells made of calcium carbonate. As those animals died and drifted to the bottom, all that calcium carbonate in the ocean floor built up and compressed into limestone over time. Then, as the ocean receded, it revealed a valley full of rivers and deltas surrounding what would become Frank a few hundred million years later.
Frank.
The growth and death cycle of vegetation over millions of years continued to compress the organic material, and about 160 million years later, the ground was rich with coal. Then, after another 70 million years or so, the tectonic plates in the earth began to press against each other and caused the earth to rise, forming what are now known as the Rocky Mountains. Part of that chain, and measuring 2,200 meters or 7,250 feet above the valley, is a peak called Turtle Mountain. As humans began to populate the area, the natives became familiar with the mountain, but they had a different name for it. They called it the Mountain That Moves, which is maybe a more fitting name. To residents in the early 1900s, however, the mountain was their livelihood, no matter what it was known as. That's kind of the generous coal seam that ran through Turtle Mountain,
Called the Mountain That Moves, buries a town under 150 feet of rock.
was discovered by two American entrepreneurs, one of which was Henry Frank, and the town was named after him afterward. When it was discovered, the town of Frank was home to just 19 people, but the opening of the Frank mine caused the population to explode to around 1,000 residents in less than 2 years as those seeking work began to settle in the shadow of Turtle Mountain. By 1903, Frank was a hive of activity compared to what it once was, as businesses popped up and a close-knit mining community formed there. On April 28, 1903, the town was still quiet in the early morning hours as residents slept soundly. Then, at 4:10 a.m., a sudden rumble tore through the quiet morning and was heard as far as 200 kilometers or 124 miles away. In an instant, 110 million tons of rock came rushing down the mountain toward Frank. This rock
Run, Frank, run!
And reached speeds over 100 kilometers an hour. The entire event took about 90 seconds, but the damage that occurred during that
Rip my sub ran out today. Buy it. Pay for it again.
time was beyond devastating. In just that short time, the town was nearly erased from the map, with some areas covered in a staggering 45 meters or 148 feet of rubble. Even some of the less covered portions of the town were buried
Frank's
under
gonna get
46
out,
feet of
chat?
mountain debris, and in total, 1.2 square miles was sitting beneath the summit of Turtle Mountain. To put the sheer amount of rock that fell into context, it was determined that a wall 1 meter or 3 feet wide and 6 meters or 20 feet tall could be built from Victoria, British Columbia, all the way to Halifax, Nova Scotia on the opposite side of the country.
Shit.
That's a total distance of 3,600 miles. In the collapse,
You think
homes,
Frank made it?
cottages, work camps, farms, and businesses
Frank
were
okay?
obliterated, and whole families were wiped out before they even knew it was happening. More than a mile of the Canadian Pacific Railway line was completely blocked, and another portion of the recently completed Frank and Grassy Mountain Railway was too. Residents who could do so then began to exit the few untouched homes or dig themselves out of the ones that were only covered by a few meters. One of them was a brakeman for the Canadian Pacific Railway and realized a train was scheduled to make its way through Frank at any minute. He then had to run across the entire unstable debris field to where the track was cleared to signal the train to stop. Fortunately, it was able to stop before it reached the disaster area. In another area where one house once stood, a resident climbed to the top of the rubble with his 3 young daughters. In the ruins of his house below, his wife and 4 sons were not so lucky.
Oh my
In the Frank
God.
mine itself, the night shift miners had no idea what happened other than that they were completely trapped. Over the course of the next 13 hours, they then had to climb their way out vertically through debris. Then, as they exited the mine, they were told that many of their family members were no longer living. In another area, another miner who had been sleeping in a work camp was thrown out of bed by the pressure wave of the immense volume of rock shooting down the mountain. 2 weeks earlier, that same miner was working when a great crack echoed throughout the many tunnels and chambers inside Turtle Mountain. After investigating, it was found that a thick timber had been snapped by the weight it was supporting. This was a harbinger of what was to come, but unfortunately it was seen as harmless at the time. Among the survivors were 3 young sisters whose parents and brothers died. They were eventually adopted by separate families and didn't reunite until 41 years later.
Oh my God.
There isn't an official count of how many people in Frank died that morning in the event that became known as the Frank Slide, but estimates go all the way up to 100.
I'm going to be frank and say that Frank ain't looking too good. Chat, I'm sure at least Frank made it out. Oh my God.
People, and it's generally agreed upon that at least 90 Frank citizens lost their lives that night.
90 Franks?
Only 18 bodies were ever recovered. In the days after the rock slide, searchers managed to recover 12 of those in the shallower areas of the rubble field, but the rest were just too deep to reach. It wasn't all the way until 1922 when another 6 were recovered when a road construction crew uncovered an entire house. This was primarily because in the aftermath, due to its sheer size, the rubble field was left where it was along with all of the buildings and people destroyed by it. As time went on, the rubble field became just another part of the town and Frank slowly got used to its new skyline. Kids would even play tag in the debris and jump from boulder to boulder, almost as if it were a new playground.
Man.
Its population, despite the great loss and uncertainty of its future, continued to flourish, and by 1906, almost 1,200 people were living there.
A Frank Slide sounds
like a
few
weeks
dance
after the
move.
landslide,
Does,
the Frank
though.
mine even reopened as workers started to make the many repairs and reconstruct the different areas inside the mine that had crumbled. However, as much as the town just wanted to move on and put the disaster behind them, the rubble field was a constant reminder for those who survived the rock slide. After a period of
Like, why would you even want to stay? Like, a rock slide destroyed an entire town. You're like, yeah, let's build right where that just happened. Why not? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? It happen again? Like,
of mourning, the town
money? What do you mean money? Everyone's dead. Frank's dead. Like, everyone's dead. What do you mean money?
turned its attention to getting answers to how this could have happened in the first place. So in 1911, a Royal Commission of Scientists was brought in to study the mountain and determine what might happen in the future. Even though the town was still growing, fears remained that something like it could happen again. And in fact, when the results were released, scientists determined that the North Peak still presented an imminent and urgent threat to Frank. The provincial government then ordered that all remaining buildings in the town be moved further away from the mountain, and over the next few years, Frank would undergo significant...
What if we take the town of Frank and push it somewhere else? They actually did it, chat. They actually pushed it somewhere else. The same thing is happening in modern Pompeii. People know it'll happen again, but they're staying put. Classic. Like that one town that we watched the video on where like everyone fucking died because of the gases in like this lake or something like that. And they all decide, yeah, let's stay here anyway. Why not? What's the worst that could happen? We all die again?
Significant changes. Some people stayed, others left, and whole buildings were lifted from their foundations and transported just to the northeast of the mountain.
They really did
Others
push it
were simply
somewhere else.
torn down, and once the Frank mine closed for good in 1918, Frank's population plummeted. The town still exists today, but it was incorporated with a handful of other towns in an area that is now known as Crow's Nest Pass. So the question is, what happened on Turtle Mountain that caused the deadly rock slide? This question wouldn't be answered all the way until the year 2000. Until that point, the blame was placed on the Frank mine as constant blasting and the removal of coal was believed to have weakened the mountain. While there is some truth to that, mine activity was actually determined to be a secondary cause. During the period of tectonic plate shifting that formed Turtle Mountain, the original horizontal layers of rock were forced upward and became vertical layers of rock. Many of these layers were also made up of soft or unstable limestone, sandstone, and shale, and over the course of millions of years, the mountain underwent the typical weathering from snow, wind, and rain. And finally, running directly through the mountain is a thrust fault. In contrast to a traditional fault line, a thrust fault pushes older rock above younger rock, and with its susceptibility to erosion, cracks formed over millennia and grew wider and wider during freeze-thaw cycles.
What?
This gradually weakened the integrity of the summit, and when the mine opened, it created further instability near its base. All of these factors came together to bring the top of the mountain to the bottom in 1903. When it was finally learned how exactly the disaster occurred, it was also determined that the mountain remains unstable and the next slide is a matter of when, not if. The only good news is that geologists believe that it won't happen for at least another 1,000 years, but all that could change, however, was one earthquake, and the province of Alberta averages 165 of them each year. Marion
Dude,
Lee.
people really just be playing with fire right there. My God. They're really just playing with fire. Yeah, it could happen in 1,000 years, but if earthquake happens, and those happen like 200 times a year. So, I mean, it might, I don't know. You might be gambling here. Ah, screw it. Let's live here anyway. Fuck it. Let's build an entire town. You know, thousands of people. Why not?
Doherty was thumbing through a magazine when his page turned and came to a sudden stop. Only recently, he had taken up a new hobby, and he looked for anything and everything to learn as much as he could about it. For as long as he could remember, Marion wanted to fly, and not just as a pilot. He had already accomplished that, and in fact, one of his earliest memories was the time he tried to fly by jumping off the roof of his grandfather's smokehouse and breaking his nose as he fell. As it turned out, Marion couldn't fly, but he could fall, and that was about the next best thing. In his 30s in 1967, he met several avid skydivers and expressed his interest in giving it a try sometime. Skydiving as a sport was still in its infancy at the time, so it wasn't every day that he crossed paths
Frank
with
is a gambling addict? I think he is.
Of course, parachuting itself had been around for a few decades at that point, but only in the 1950s did jumping out of an airplane become a recreational activity. By the 1960s, skydiving schools were sprouting up everywhere, and more people were entertaining the idea of at least giving it a try. For Marion, it didn't take a lot of convincing, and just a few days later, he was in a plane with a parachute on his back. When the side door of the plane slid open and it was time to jump, however, he wasn't nearly as eager as he was standing atop the smokehouse.
Did he die his first jump or something?
During that first attempt, he completely froze up and the jump was aborted. But unwilling to let his fear get the better of him, he was back on a plane a few days later, and this time he got to fulfill his childhood dream. From that first moment of feeling his body speeding toward terminal velocity as he fell toward Earth, Marion was hooked. As a trucker by trade, he traveled the US and always looked for airfields and drop zones along his route. That day, though, as he looked through the skydiving magazine, there was a jump in Ohio on August 27th that year. This was a special jump. It was going to be from an altitude of 20,000 feet or nearly 6,100 meters. Even today, the average skydive usually begins about...
Yeah, that's not 20,000 feet. Yeah, your measurements are off.
Half that, at 10,000 feet. This would be a much more advanced jump for Marion. At the time, he had fewer than 10 jumps under his belt, but he just couldn't pass up the opportunity.
You're off.
So that morning, he got into his plane and flew to Ortner Airport, which is a small private airfield located in Erie County, Ohio, just west of Cleveland. When he got there, he was surprised by the number of people who showed up for the jump. There were at least 30 other skydiving enthusiasts on site, ready to take advantage of this rare opportunity. When everyone was ready, a decommissioned B-25 would take off and fly out over Lake Erie to gain the necessary altitude. Once at 20,000 feet, the plane would make its way close to Ortner airspace and then give the signal when it was okay to jump. One at a time, 18 of the 20 jumpers would leap from the plane, experience what it was like to freefall for 17,000 feet. Then, once they reached the 3,000 foot mark, parachutes would be deployed and the skydivers would head for a soft landing back on Ortner Airport property. The final two parachutists were more advanced and they'd remain on board for a jump from 30,000 feet. The excited group then introduced themselves to each other and geared up, and when the time came, the pilot gave the go-ahead to board and the parachutists began filling the B-25. As more of them piled in, the plane's nose wheel lifted right off the ground. This meant that the plane was overweighted, so while unfortunate, several skydivers would have to miss out on the jump. The pilot then called back and broke the news, requesting that those with the fewest number of jumps get off the plane. Unfortunately, with only a handful under his belt, Marion was one of those individuals, so he stood up disappointed and walked off.
Okay.
Two other men, Robert Coy and Bernard Johnson, were much more experienced.
Okay, I don't know why they all look pregnant, but like it's like their balls are pregnant. Like that swollen balls.
Experienced skydivers made the cut to their relief. With only 20 jumpers now on board, the B-25 could safely take off, and soon it was in the sky, climbing its way to 20,000.
What? Am I wrong? Does this not look like pregnant men? Stop looking at their balls. I'm not. It's what it looks like. Why are you question marking me? They have backpacks on their balls? They have backpacks on their balls. That's what you're saying. That's gayer than me, pig. Fuck you guys. All right.
Once airborne, a Cessna 180 took off right behind the B-25 with a pilot and two photographers to take pictures of the dive.
You all know
The
it,
B-25,
right?
meanwhile, continued its climb, and once it reached the target altitude, just like the plan called for, the pilot gave the thumbs
Their
up
fanny
and
packs?
the door was open.
What kind of fanny pack looks like that? That's like an entire like sack.
25, meanwhile, continued its climb, and once it reached the target altitude, just like the plan called for, the pilot gave the thumbs up and the door
Their
was open.
IRL streaming pig, leave
Robert
them
and Bernard
alone.
then
All right.
anxiously awaited their turns as they watched the others disappear off the edge of the plane. In a matter of moments, the two men were in a controlled freefall toward Earth.
Can you tell your bird
Now,
to stop
the
talking?
weather that
No.
day had been hit or miss with overcast skies and periods of rain. The 18 skydivers were falling toward a thick layer of low-hanging clouds, and each of them disappeared into them around the 6,000-foot mark. As they closed in on the time to deploy their parachutes,
Dude,
Robert and Bernard
That'd be too like that'd be cool. Don't get me wrong, that'd be cool, but that'd also be insanely scary.
cleared through the clouds and got their first look at what was below them. From the plane, no one could see the ground, so when they were finally able to, they were met with the horrifying realization that there was no ground below them, only the waters of Lake Erie. Upon seeing this, panic immediately set in among the skydivers.
How did that even
While all
happen?
their parachutes deployed properly, once they hit the water, these large chutes would quickly become a heavy hazard once wet. Frantically, Robert and Bernard began cutting away any surplus weight from their bodies, and when they were low enough to do so safely, they cut themselves free of their chutes and dropped into the choppy water. When they had come through the cloud cover, they were able to see the shoreline.
You're right, Pig. Your Mpreg fan art would be cool. I didn't ask for someone to draw a fan art of me pregnant. What?
After surfacing in the lake, the only thing in sight was water in all directions. That's because they'd landed upwards of 5 miles or 8 kilometers offshore and even further from the airport. Something at some point had gone terribly wrong. Even worse,
did they do it on
people ashore
purpose?
spotted the skydivers and their bright parachutes gently falling into the lake, but because of how each of them landed in the water one at a time, it looked like some sort of planned, synchronized jump. It just never occurred to anyone that the skydivers hadn't intended to land in the lake. Back in the sky, the pilot began to climb again and turned around over the water, and when he did, he spotted a break in the clouds and could see what was below him for the first time. It was nothing but water, and he remarked to his co-pilot that he hoped they didn't drop the skydivers over the lake. Then, once the plane reached 30,000 feet, the pilot went to the next drop zone, and the other two jumped and landed at the airport without incident. When these two skydivers in the plane touched down to find no one else in the airport, the truth of what happened started to reveal itself. Authorities were then immediately notified, and everyone from the Coast Guard to the local yacht club raced out to the air where the parachutists were last seen. Within the first few hours after the jump, Robert was spotted by a private boat and scooped up. Then, less than a mile from him, Bernard was rescued by the same boat after he spent hours staying afloat by using the styrofoam in his helmet as flotation. An extensive search also got underway, and a search area of more than 105 square miles, or 272 square kilometers, was combed over the course of 53 straight hours by more than 400
5
people.
miles isn't too far from land. Swim it. Swim 1 mile. You know what? Swim half a mile. See how you feel after that. 5 miles is very far from land. Fuck are you talking about? At least they made it.
But
You sure about
when
that?
the search was called off, Robert and Bernard were the only survivors among those
You sure about that? Are you sure?
who ended up in Lake Erie. Then, of the 16 who died, only 15 of the bodies were eventually recovered. Following an investigation, it was realized that things started to go wrong with the conditions that day. The weather wasn't cooperating, and several times during his flight to Ordner Airport, Marion even considered turning around because he was convinced the jump would be scrapped. There are several cardinal rules of skydiving, and one of them is that you never jump if you can't see your target. The cloud cover that day was considerable, but the school organizing the jump proceeded anyway. Then, once in the air above the clouds, the pilot should have canceled the jump, but he too proceeded with everything as planned. Then, because of how low visibility was, the pilot had to rely on air traffic controllers to be his guide, which was a procedure that started out as planned.
I don't get it.
In the middle
I mean, what year was this again, chat? I don't remember. But like, don't they have technology to like tell whether or not, like what location they are or something like that?
of tracking the B-25, however, the controller was relieved and a new one came over the radio. When this new controller looked at his radar, he could see that the B-25 was only about 3 miles from the airport and in the drop zone, so he gave the clearance for the jump. Only the plane he was tracking wasn't the B-25. It was instead the Cessna 180 with the 2 photographers aboard. In reality, the B-25 was nowhere near the airport, and so the skydivers jumped from the plane, having no idea that many of them were in the last moments of their life.
No!
The day after the search was called off, Marion organized a flight with 5 other planes to fly over the landing site. During this, each of the pilots dumped rose petals in tribute to the 16 people who died there just a few days earlier.
God damn. 16 people fucking died. That's crazy. 16?
For more than a century, military service was mandatory for nearly all Chilean men between 18 and
Dude, how awful must that pilot feel, though? Like, that pilot's gotta feel like a real dumbass.
45 years old. Thankfully, this term of service for army recruits was just a year, and few Chilean soldiers ever saw combat or found themselves in life-threatening situations. Men generally viewed the military service as a civic duty and a rite of passage, and after fulfilling their commitments, most moved on to jobs and lives in the civilian world. But even still, recruits had to get through a tough basic training regimen that included exhaustive physical training in some of the country's most remote and inhospitable regions. There was also a long-standing tradition in the Chilean army that new recruits from the 17th Mountain Regiment made a grueling hike up and around the Antuco volcano each year in
Why?
May. This volcano towers nearly 9,800 feet, or almost 3,000 meters over the valley below, and it hasn't been active since the late 1800s. But its steep slopes, rugged terrain, and unpredictable weather can turn it from a difficult hike into a deadly one very quickly. However, despite this, each year officers led new recruits on this annual mountain hike, and along the way they engaged in various military exercises designed to toughen the young soldiers up and hone their survival skills. In 2005, 485 recruits from 5 army companies took part in the march, and nearly all of them were from the Chilean city of Los Angeles, about 60 miles east of the volcano. At that point, most were still teenagers who had only been in the army for a few months, and the plan was for them and their commanding officers to hike from a camp at Los Barros to an
Dude, that is bonkers. Like, just imagine, you're just a teenager, you just enlisted to the army 2 months later. Hey, you want to climb this insanely dangerous mountain? You're probably going to die. It'll be fun, though.
Elevation of about 5,600 feet or 1,700 meters. From there, they'd continue on the rest of the 18-mile trek that wound its way around the base of the volcano. Then, if everything went according to plan, they'd take a much-needed rest before returning to their original starting point. Before the hike began, Commanding Officer Major Patricio Saraceda received a report from Chile's Meteorological Service that warned of a strong winter storm approaching the volcano.
Imagine joining the military and dying to a mountain.
Understood just how bad the weather was about to get. This may have been in part because he and his junior officers had led similar training missions in poor conditions before, and after all, the whole idea was to take the recruits out of their comfort zones to see what they are made of. Under ordinary circumstances, this may have been totally fine.
Or something.
Additionally, only one of the 5 companies was equipped with boots, parkas, winter gear, and mountain survival equipment because no one expected it to be needed. Instead, most only had—
So hiking equipment wasn't expected to be needed? When you're going on a dangerous hike? What?
standard boots, uniforms, caps, and sleeping bags that weren't adequate for much more than a moderately cool night outdoors. Nonetheless, on the morning of May 18th, 2005, nearly 500 young men and officers set off from Los Barros. Early on, they were battered by steady rain and heavy winds on their way to their first scheduled stop at a shelter known as La Cortina. The conditions weren't anything most of them hadn't experienced before, but over the next several hours, the temperature dropped below freezing, wind gusts topped 50 miles or 80 kilometers an hour, and the rain turned into sleet and snow.
Shit.
Then, to make matters worse, visibility dropped to near zero, and the daytime sky turned nearly as dark as night. Eventually, the snow became so blinding that recruits had trouble seeing others who were just an arm's length away from them. Later, some even compared the experience to being engulfed by a white tsunami. As conditions continued to deteriorate, one group got so lost that they weren't sure who, if anyone, was actually leading them, but by then, all they could do was continue on and hope to find some shelter. Along the way, they resorted to forming human chains by placing their hands on the shoulders of the recruit in front of them. However, this was almost impossible to maintain for very long in the rugged terrain, darkness, and wind. Meanwhile, others shouted at regular intervals to stay in earshot of the rest of the group. But despite these conditions and their inadequate training and gear, they somehow forged—
You look uncomfortable. You might want to take off those shorts and even your underwear, King. Nah, I'm good.
on and made it to the shelter, where they instantly collapsed. Most considered themselves lucky to just be alive, and they assumed that they'd hunker down and wait for conditions to improve before heading back out into the storm. But then, to their surprise, commanding officers from 2 companies forced more than 70 of the 485 men up after just a short rest. A few concerned recruits persuaded some of the others to directly disobey these orders, but either way, eventually, the others who were too afraid to disobey direct orders did as they were told and continued marching through freezing temperatures, wind, and waist-deep snow. By then, they were in even worse conditions than before, and some of the recruits came to the startling realization that they should have headed back with the others, and that their chances of surviving the ordeal were
Just
rapidly—
do the Wim Hof breathing method. You'll survive. Their chances of surviving the ordeal is rapidly dwindling, Chad.
dwindling. During this, many of the recruits prayed, and as the hike continued, many became separated from the main group due to poor visibility and sheer exhaustion. But one by one, they continued wandering through the darkness. Some fell face down into the snow and simply couldn't muster up enough strength to get up again. As others saw this and walked by with frostbitten faces, they knew they were powerless to help. Sadly, they had little choice but to leave them where they lay and try to save themselves. Eventually,
God,
some of these
brutal.
recruits managed to
Holy
find an
shit.
abandoned shelter, but when they went inside, they were shocked and angered to find 9 officers who'd abandoned them hours before. As all of this was going on, when the full force of the storm was realized by the military, a full-scale search and rescue operation was immediately launched. Already by then, though, the reports they'd received had been so dire that the commander-in-chief said it would take a miracle for survivors to be rescued before they died of hypothermia. In addition, the extreme weather showed no sign of letting up, and getting personnel and resources to the area was no easy task. In fact, it wasn't until the following Monday that several special units with canines reached the slopes and began probing for survivors with long steel poles. Over the next few days, searchers found and recovered 26 bodies, most of which were lying face down under as much as 13 feet of snow. Some of these had managed to climb into their thin sleeping bags before being covered with
straight snow and 13
snow and ice and succumbing to hypothermia. Even more
Do they not have the Weather Channel? Just turn on the TV. Get on your phone, idiot. Chat, I realized it was the 19 early life. It was a joke, all right? So don't come in here calling me stupid. It was a joke.
chillingly, some were found frozen solid in standing position, still holding their rifles.
Turn on the Weather Channel.
In another area, one recruit was discovered hugging a sergeant.
Bad joke if you have to explain it. I'm explaining it so Chad doesn't yell at me. It was a good joke. They're just gonna be mean.
Apparently in a last-ditch effort to survive by sharing one another's body heat.
It's not a real body,
When
Chad.
the search finally ended, 45 bodies had been recovered, of which one was an officer and the rest were recruits. The last body was found and identified on July 6,
It was 2005? Are you fucking serious? Wait, hold up. No, it wasn't.
almost 2 months later. In the aftermath, understandably, across the country, elected officials, high-ranking military officers, the general public, and the media expressed outrage that such a tragedy could have occurred. For their obvious errors in judgment that ultimately led to nearly 4 dozen deaths, Major Saraseta and 2 others were immediately relieved of duty. There were even rumors of an impending court-martial, but in the meantime, military and civilian investigations were launched to determine why the exercise hadn't been postponed until weather conditions improved. Eventually, though, both of these investigations came to the same unavoidable conclusion. The fact was that the tragedy was entirely preventable, and all it would have taken to save the lives of everyone was a modest 1 or 2 day postponement. The investigation also determined that the recruits who directly disobeyed their superiors' orders had indeed saved their own lives. Of the officers involved, 9 were officially sanctioned and several were forced to officially retire. But in addition to this forced retirement, Major Saraseta received a 5-year prison sentence, of which he served 3 years and 9 months before being released in early November of 2011. In the end,
I honestly feel like that's not enough. He's the only one who got a sentence. Like, they literally killed multiple, like, young people. Like, literally killed many young people. For that shit.
Should have been an exhausting but otherwise uneventful march turned into the worst peacetime disaster in Chilean military history. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story
I didn't make it this far.
Now it's time to walk away. I hope you enjoyed your stay. Did you laugh or cry or maybe subscribed? I'll thank you either way. You know I will miss you. I hope you return. Tell your friend or your mother to get me more views, please.